I'm Ruth Siddall and I'm a geologist, and I work on artist pigments and other aspects of geological materiality in cultural history. Pigments are my main area of research, and I've worked on characterising pigments primarily using microscopy from an art historical context ranging from archaeological through to working with modern artists. Actually, the science of colour is incredibly complex, and most of it is well beyond me, and it does operate at at a crystallographic scale. You can get pigments from dyes, which are from organic plants and animals, or you can get them from inorganic chemical entities. And I think that's where I come in as a geologist, because certainly many of the inorganic chemical compounds are analogous to minerals that we see in the environment. Some of them, of course, are minerals, like ultramarine coming from lapis lazuli, or red and yellow ochres, and so on and so forth. They're pure geological materials. But of course, we have synthetic analogues of those that have been made by people in a lab, but crystallographically, they're exactly the same. So the techniques that I use as a geologist are really applicable for looking at these things down the microscope. And to be honest, that extends to organic compounds as well, dyes. There are so many interesting colour stories, and many of them are repeated by people like me all the time. I think I'm quite drawn to poisonous pigments and things that can do you harm, and also unusual things. I think probably, actually, this is not my favourite story, it's probably the worst story I've ever heard, which is a pigment called mummy, which was made from the ground bones of Egyptian mummies. And when these started to run out, they were manufactured illicitly by Ottoman jailers who would possibly even murder people to order and soak them in bitumen to sell to Western colourmen in the 19th century. And it's just an appalling story. So I wouldn't say that's the favourite, but you know, the lengths that people would go to get colour would be quite astonishing. And I have seen some of these so-called mummy pigments under the microscope. And I've also worked a lot on Egyptian coffins, so I'm quite used to the components that you see. And you know, you do see ground up human bone and degraded linen fibres and yeah, all your mummy wrappings. So that's quite grim. And these paints were used by Victorian artists. There's a story, and I forget which way it works, that Edward Burne-Jones was visiting Alma Tadema, or vice versa, and one of them was saying, "Hey, have you seen this wonderful mummy pigment?" And the other said, "Do you know that is a real human being?" And I think it was Alma Tadema who found this out. He was so horrified they went and buried the tube of paint in the garden with full Christian ceremony. But yeah, that's a pretty terrible material to use.
What colour it is?
Brown. It's exactly the colour you imagine, but because there's quite a lot of bitumen in there, which incidentally was rarely used in the ancient Egyptian mummification process, so that's slightly worrying. It would give a lovely glaze, so it was a very popular pigment for painting shadows, because it was slightly transparent. So that was what it was mainly used for. I've collaborated with Winsor Newton over the last 3 years in supervising a PhD student at UCL, my home institution. And through that, it's given me access to the Winsor Newton archive collection, which is just a treasure house for somebody like me, and certainly improved my knowledge of 19th century pigments through looking at materials from that collection, which has been a really fantastic opportunity. That's a good question. I love colour. I think there's probably I think there's too much colour around now, and not that I mind that, I don't have a problem with that, but I think we have to, or particularly somebody in my line of work, you know, if I'm looking at Roman painting or Egyptian painting, you know, colour would not have been everywhere. Everywhere would have been pretty drab unless you were very wealthy. And I think it's very difficult for us to visualise those, to be honest, pre-aniline dye days, you know, before the 1850s, when there was this huge proliferation of colours in terms of clothing and other dyed and coloured material. I'm looking at the red extension lead here. You know, everything would have just been brown, I think, before then. The only places you would have seen colour would have been in flower gardens and stained glass windows, you know. So I think it's interesting, but not something I know an awful lot about historically. I would like people to see that there's a lot more to pigments and colour than just little ready-made tubes of material that you buy off the shelf in an art shop. That, you know, these are materials that have huge stories to them, they have traditions. In terms of their materiality, they have a wide variety of provenances, and, you know, some of those go way back as well. And I think also to realise that artists don't just go and choose any yellow or any red or any blue, you know, that artists have attachments to particular colours. And I am very drawn to artists who have got a strong interest in materials and materiality, especially when it comes to pigments. So yes, I'd like people to realise that there are stories to these materials and there's much more meaning to them than just red or green or whatever. Blue. Everybody's favourite colour is blue. But it is mine, I have to be honest.